All right, hi guys. We'll get started. So one of the things that we mentioned last week is that when bees are doing well and there's a floral abundance in their environment, they collect nectar not just to eat and pollen not just to eat, but they also store it. So one of the comments that we had, I think it was from Jeff, was around that he wasn't aware previously that bees actually eat their own honey. And that's definitely true. Bees 100% eat their own honey. The reason that we are comfortable in taking some of that honey is that they do a really good job of storing a lot of honey. So we talked last week about the bottom box being the brood box, which is where the baby bees I guess born and are looked after, and the queen stays down there and lay her eggs. We saw that there were resources down there from pollen to nectar to honey. And then we talked about there being a gate, the queen excluder, between both boxes. So that gate makes the queen stay down in the brood box where there's plenty of space for her to lay, but it does mean that there's not going to be eggs or brood up in the honey super. So this is where we're going to be playing around with today. This is our honey super, and we briefly looked into it last week to check how the honey was going. There was a couple of frames in this hive that looked very full, and then off camera we looked into the second hive, and some of them were getting full, half full. So we won't touch that because we want the bees to have enough stores for themselves. Say for instance this weather turns into a rainy period and they are trapped at home, because bees tend not to fly when it's wet and raining. They stay at home, so we want to make sure that they've got enough honey stores to keep them fed for a period of time. But we'll open up the back of this one and we'll have a look. You might be able to come a little closer, Miss Durie, and we'll pick a frame to tap today. So I don't know if it's going to focus really well, but it's a bit hard to see. So all through our frames we've got nectar, and as we talked about last week, the bees tend to fill from the inside out in like an arc fashion, like a rainbow. So when they get right to the edge here and they fill up these cells, it is a good indication that the whole frame is filled with honey. Now, we cheated a little bit last week, and off camera we looked in this frame and this frame, and both of these frames were very, very full. Not 100% capped, but very close to it. So you can see a few cells that are empty, and that's perfectly normal. Sometimes I leave cells empty so that bees can, I guess, use them as resting places, or you know, they might have that extra capacity to fill it when there's a really big flow on. It's actually starting to sprinkle here a little bit, which is never great conditions to do a bee inspection, but because we've got a flow hive and the way in which we're getting the honey doesn't really disturb the bees a whole heap, we'll be nice and safe. Did you guys have any questions before we get underway?
No.
Have you ever been down here, Sheridan or Shannon, for a honey tapping before?
No, never.
Well, today's the day. So we talked last week about these being a unique bee hive called flow hive. And the cool thing about this, the technology in it, is all in this honey super. So these are frames that are printed so that the honeycomb structures can be split in half. And when the honeycomb is split in half, the honey from inside of it can trickle down into a trough and then out into a jar. So seeing as you're on the camera, I might get you to help Shannon crack one of these frames. Do you have a particular, do you want to go to the dark honey or the lighter colour honey?
What's the difference?
Well, last week we talked about how where the bees collect the honey influences the flavour. It also influences the colour. So typically speaking, and not always the truth, that darker honey will be more thick. And is that viscous, or is it less viscous?
More
viscous?
Yeah, I think so.
Anyway, it'll be thicker and slower coming out, but it's normally got a richer, bolder taste. So we could go with a lighter one that could trickle out a little bit faster, but maybe doesn't have as much punch for flavour. Up to you.
Let's go with the dark one.
Go with the dark one. So we'll get that underway. So this is our tool for today. It's a flow hive access key, I think it's called. It's essentially a big bar that Shannon's going to twist, and that will make our hexagonal cells crack just a millimetre or two and allow the honey to trickle through. So there you go. What we're going to do though today, because it's a little bit wet and we'd like to do a bee inspection, instead of it just trickling down into a jar with an open lid, we're going to use a jar that has a closed lid and a pipe. because when we do a bee inspection, there'll be more bees flying around and more chances they'll get themselves trapped in the honey. So to keep things nice and clean and to keep our bees, I guess, away from drowning, because they can drown in their own honey, we've just got a mason jar with a food-safe, food-grade plastic, and we'll let Shannon do all the hard work. So this is, you might have to help me crack, oh no, here it comes. So that's the trough where the honey will drip down into, and there's often a little bits of propolis and stuff where the bees, can you see the bees? You won't be able to see it on the camera, but there's a little gate here that will trickle back down when we're finished, and you can see the bees' tongues and legs coming up through there.
It goes in through there.
Yeah, yeah. Oh no, not that.
Oh.
That's the trickle back one. Yeah. Sorry, I was getting a little bit distracted. So the access is up here.
Close.
And if you
Nowhere near it.
Yes. If you want to run the tool in underneath this, now we're probably going to put it in about a third, so about there, just to begin with. And when Shannon twists it, it'll crack those hexagons and the honey will start to trickle down. I'm going to put this in here so that when it does trickle out, we don't end up with honey everywhere or ants and things. Yep, so twist it either way, yep. It's quite hard because the bees have stuck it together. There you go, so she's cracked it now. And Sheridan, you might be able to get a bit of a closer view. But what's happened here is those cells have been cracked and the honey's very slowly starting to go between those cells and trickling down into the trough, which is good. Like I said, we had some ants. And the ants,
there it comes.
Yeah, starting to come out, which is fine. It'll take a little while. But once it builds a head of steam, normally when we do this with kids down here, we'll have like a group of 12 and they've all got their own honey jar and they're all desperate to put it underneath the pipe to go. We don't often use these tubes to keep them, so it's just straight under and away they go. And that's as easy as it is to get honey out of a flow hive. But
No, it is slow, isn't it?
yeah, it'll take a little while. So we'll leave that for a bit. What we might do is we might go and check on our nuke hive. I think I mentioned last week that we had 2 nuke hives, one that was queenless and one that had just had a hatched queen or an emerged queen, probably not the right word, hatched. They hatch from an egg when they're, in the larvae stage, but they emerge from a cell. So we'll let that go, and that'll trickle away, and away it goes. We might actually, do you want to switch with Shannon and you can crack it a little bit further? Sheridan, do you want to, it's only about a third of the way, and seeing as it's taking so long to come out, we can probably crack it 2/3 of the way.
Okay.
The reason we don't do it the whole way is that it can create a big wave of honey and it gets so full that it starts going back up and trickling down into the hive, which again is not normally a problem because the bees will clean it up, but it's lost honey from our jar, so we try not to do that. So maybe switcheroo rolls and you can come and crack this next part. So same deal, so just push it in to about there and then you're just going to twist it round. So it's not overly easy, but there you go. Maybe Sheridan's got those extra muscles today. That's it. Perfect. Yeah, once you've twisted it, it'll stay there. So that's about 2/3 of the way into the hive. So 2/3 of that frame has been cracked and it'll slowly work its way out. But while that's doing it, why don't we have a look in our nuke hive and see how our queen's going? Would you girls like to help with that?
Would love to.
Yep.
Love to. So look, because we lit the smoker well and truly, oh no, it's still there, 10 minutes ago, I was assuming that it would have gone out. And I might just chuck on a bee suit and a few different things. I might get, Sheridan, do you want to be the smoker today? That didn't sound real good, did it? Alright, so I'm just going to chuck my bee suit on. Oops, if I do it right. Perhaps while I'm getting myself dressed, if anyone had any questions about the honey part of today's demonstration, now would be a good time to ask, and we'll try and answer them as best as we can before we do our inspection. Any questions coming up? Oh, that's right, there's a delay, isn't there?
Yeah, there's a little bit of a delay. None coming up yet.
Keep an eye on it. There you go, you've got it going, Miss Durie.
Looks good.
So if you wanted to, Sheridan, just do a couple of puffs in the entrance of that nuke hive and a couple of puffs in the back. That's it, and then just one at the front will be laughing.
Yeah.
Unless it makes them shoot from.
You just got to get in nice and close there. That'll do. And then we'll give it a second or two so that the bees get the message and they start eating their nectar. Any questions about the honey, Shannon?
No, not yet.
Often what we do is we get you guys to taste it as it was trickling out, but seeing as we're living in a world right now where
No.
we don't want to be spreading any germs, we won't even take the risk of it.
Slowly coming.
Yeah, it's a very, very slow hive, and the reason for that is that I don't have it on a very steep angle. So
Harry would like to know, how long will it take to fill up this jar?
so that's a good question.
And Paxton Public School are asking, how long does it take to get a full frame of honey out?
Okay, so a similar question. That jar is about 2.5 litres worth of honey, so about 3 kilos worth of honey. Typically, a full frame will fill that whole jar up. And then sometimes if the bees have actually extruded out those frames just a little bit, which they can do if they need extra space, fill up a whole jar and maybe even another 200 mils in another jar. So I've got a spare one in the bag. Time-wise, it's all dependent. So it depends on how hot the day is, because that impacts on how viscous the honey is. Depends on where the honey's been collected. Obviously, thicker honey takes a lot longer to come out. And it also depends on how the hive is sitting. So these hives are fairly level. They're on a slight incline so that the honey does drip out the trough. But as time goes on and hives settle into their places, sometimes they level out a little bit. So this hive, I just said, is a very slow hive. So I really need to prop it up a little bit more at the front so that it'll run out a little faster. But typically, so like on a nice warm sunny day, nothing like today, on a nice warm sunny day, you can get a full jar within about 40 minutes or so. And that's a pretty impressive feat, because it can take quite a lot of bees to fill up that much honey in the hive, like thousands and thousands of bees.
Beautiful. Kobe has also asked, what influences whether the honey is light or dark in colour?
Well, can you guys answer that? What's the reason for the colour being different in the
It depends where the bees are getting the pollen from, Kobe. So we've been looking, Mr. Durie's actually shown Miss Lewis and I today where we can look at the different colours of pollen coming to the hive. So we've seen some red, some white, some orange and some yellow pollen going in today. So that will change the colour of the honey.
So it's just all down to the types of trees they pick them up from. So like clover honeys are particularly light in colour, whereas some of the jellybush honeys, which are a similar tree in Australia that we have that's similar to manuka honey, are very dark, and they're almost jellybush honey. They're very much a thick red honey as well. So I'm just going to open this up. So last week I said that we had an emerged queen in here, and what I'm hoping to see today when we do our bee inspection is that we find the emerged queen and that she started to lay.
What is that, Mr. Durie?
So this is a pollen paddy, so it's I guess a fast food for bees, and I put it in here last time I did an inspection because I was worried that there wasn't a lot of natural pollen sources out around at the time, because it was during the dry period. But it's probably unnecessary. So the bees won't eat this fast food if they're finding pollen around in the environment, and it's just there just in case they they need that extra protein. So what I'm doing here is I'm just cracking those frames from that propolis. Remember that sticky tree sap kind of super glue that the bees are able to make and stick things together. And the reason they do that is because they like to keep it nice and airtight. So instead of having a drafty hive that leaks the warmth of the bees, they use this sticky resin, which is called propolis, to keep things nice and tight. And by all means, they've really stuck these frames down. So
Lacey would like to know if the honey runs quicker in warmer weather.
Yes, they do. So if it was a 35 degree day or a 40 degree day, the honey would definitely come out a lot faster. So those time estimations are all dependent on so many different factors. And it's not just to do with where the bees collect them, it's also to do with what the temperature is today. And today's pretty cool, really, so we probably don't have much luck in getting our honey out quick. So what I'm doing is I'm just looking for the queen, but if you remember last week, what we said that we do is that if you can't find the queen, you can always look for evidence that she's been there. So things like eggs that have been laid in the cells, or larvae. And in this one, there doesn't seem to be either. There is some nectar. It's really hard to, I'm sure it's almost impossible to pick up on your camera, or the camera. But inside here is a whole heap of nectar, and the bees are just gorging themselves on that at the moment because we've smoked them. So we talked about that last week, about how the smoke makes them think perhaps there's a bushfire around.
Paxton would like to know if our bees travel over the hill to Paxton to look for different plants.
That's a good question. Yeah, look, I'm not sure where these ones have been. I haven't been tracking them, but bees have been known to fly 5 to 6 kilometres from their hive to look for nectar sources and pollen sources. Obviously, in doing so, they won't be travelling past good pollen and nectar that's here in Millfield. But if there's a big bloom on over in Paxton and there's not much doing in Millfield, for sure, I think we'd be, 5 kilometres or so as the crow flies or as the bee flies, and it's definitely something that can be there. Now, our queen bee, like we said, would have emerged recently and should have done her mating flights. She's not on this frame, or not that I can see, unless you guys have got a super eye.
Oh, your eyesight's better than mine.
What's a little concerning, though, is that this here is called a queen cup, and they would only make a queen cup if they weren't happy with the queen. So if you can look here, that's a cell that they've made, and I'm just going to tip it up. It's a little bit hard for me to do. I'm just going to tip it up and see if there's any eggs inside it. Oh, maybe there is. There's a couple of queen cups next to it. Oh, and there's some larvae there. Okay, this is interesting. So can you get that camera just to look next to the queen cup? Can you see the white things next to them? Can you see those white things? Are they turning up on your camera?
Don't think so.
Can you see them, Sheridan? Just prove to those at home that aren't...
I can see them with my eyes, but I don't know.
Can you see the white stuff?
I can.
So they're bee larvae. So the queen has been laying, but like I said last week, the hive needs a strong, productive queen. And if they're not happy with the queen, they'll do what I think is happening here, and they'll supersede her. So they'll take an egg from a hive, the hive, and they'll raise their own queen from that. So I haven't found the queen yet, but it might be that this hive has decided that she's a dud and they're going to replace her.
I think it's the Tweedies. They'd like to know what plants they can plant at home to encourage the bees to visit them.
Well, that's a great question. Look, there's oodles of information online around what bees pollinator-friendly gardens look like. The ones that I know that bees really, really like to visit, particularly this time of year, are any of our fruit and vegetable plants that are sitting in our garden. So over in our garden at school at the moment, our sweet peas and our peas are absolutely humming because the flowers have come out, so they're pollinating that area. A lot of native plants like your bottle brushes and alike have a really rich source of nectar, and not just for bees but also for birds. But there's not one particular type of plant. Fruit trees through to herbs and vegetables are really good nectar producers. But really there's a lot of different things. Even like we mentioned clover, you wouldn't plant clover, but if your garden or if your grass gets patches of clover, sometimes it's nice to let that clover grow a little longer than you would normally and let it go to flower because the bees will benefit. I'm just having another look. I can't find the queen, but I can definitely find that queen cell. There's actually a couple in there. So I think what's happened is that the hive has decided that the queen wasn't a high quality queen and they're raising their own, which is a natural process. But it's a little concerning for me because at this time of the year, there's not a lot of boy bees floating around for her to be mated with. So it's, you know, I guess the bees will be trying. They've obviously decided that having the last queen wasn't good enough and that they're going to replace her. Which, you know, they know better than us, but she's definitely not there. It was only like a week ago after we filmed, we actually had a peek in, and she looked like she was quite good. She looked big and healthy and strong, but she hadn't started laying. It seems to be that they've let her start laying, and then they've superseded her straight away. So there's lots of larvae there, and there's a couple of queen cups. You can see the bees going straight back to that peanut shape because I brushed the wax on it, which has made it indented. So they're fixing that. Because I made a, you know, I shouldn't have touched it. They're very calm. So anyway, there you go. I was hoping that we'd have a laying queen, and that we could all have a bit of a chat around what we could call her. But at the moment, it's a bit of a false start. I'll just one more look on this frame. What I'm looking for is the queen. There's no evidence.
No, I can't see her either.
She's a lot longer and she stands out. She's kind of struts herself around. Miss Lewis and I, after last week's live from the hive, had a peek in here and she was really easy to see. Okay, well there you go. Not what I was expecting to do today. Not what I was expecting to find, but this is the joy of being a beekeeper and the joy of you know, being in tune with the environment. Because there's so much nectar coming in and pollen coming in, the bees have obviously decided that now is the time to replace their queen. Didn't give her much of a run, only gave her a week or two, no. So they must have decided really quick that she was a dud. And
so why would they think she's a dud?
Oh, so it's tricky to know why the bees are superseding their queen. Often it's because they're getting old and they're running out of fertilised eggs to lay. This queen could have gone out on a mating flight and perhaps didn't mate with a lot of drones, so perhaps they know that a lot of the larvae aren't high quality. They can smell from the pheromones of the larvae if they've got any genetic problems, and often the bees will remove those larvae to stop the need for them to raise them. So perhaps she started laying eggs and a lot of them, or a high percentage of them, were duds, and they decided that it's better to roll the dice, replace her with a couple of high quality eggs, which they now are feeding royal jelly, not a huge amount of pollen, but it's something that the nurse bees are only able to excrete, and the nurse bees are fairly recently hatched bees, so we might actually a little bit later give them a bit of a helping hand. So there's a fair few bees in there, but it's not jam-packed. What I've found in the past is that when you have a healthy, strong hive like these two hives, they tend to raise better queens, and the reason they do that is because they've got more resources. So what we might do is we might steal a frame from this hive or that hive. Probably not that hive because we're getting honey from it, but we might steal a frame from this hive and put it into this hive, just so that they've got extra resources, so that they're, you know, the queens that they do raise are a higher quality. Now, I got a question for you. I wonder if somebody in the comments can answer it, and you've obviously got a 30-second delay. But if an egg takes 3 days to hatch, so the queen would have laid it earlier, how long does it take for a queen to emerge? And we talked about it last week. So a worker bee goes for 21 days, and I said the brood, I was wrong. I think I said around 28, and I think it's only 24. I did look at that one after. It's definitely longer than a worker bee. But my question is, how long should we expect for these bees to be raising from an egg through to a queen cell that's about to emerge? Do either of you guys know?
I wouldn't have a clue.
I'll give you a clue. It's a sweet number.
Sweet number?
Sweet number.
Okay, well, while we're waiting for that, Kobe and Masani would both like to know how many bees live in our hives,
yeah,
approximately.
Oh yeah, there's no, I mean, I don't particularly want to send out census information.
Sorry, Vinny's guess is a week.
Sorry, a week? Oh, a little bit longer, mate. So not 7 days. You're a little short on the number, but I thought my clue would be easy, but it's obviously not. I'll give it a minute or two. I'll answer the other question.
We've got a lot of guesses popping up right now.
Somebody, I'm sure, will get it. So look, in these two big strong hives, you would expect this time of the year to be about 30,000 bees in each. So you've got,
Whoa.
anywhere between 20 and 60,000. But this time of year, you're in autumn and it's starting to slow down. The bees might be restricting the queen to stop laying eggs. She can lay a good virile queen with lots of resources around and space to lay. Can lay anywhere between 1,000 and 1,500 eggs a day. So in the middle of summer, generally that's when there's a lot of floral resources out. There's a lot of bees moving, a lot of bees bringing them back to the hive, and she'll be laying 1,500 eggs a day. Now that doesn't mean that the population increases 1,500 each day, because it takes time for them to hatch out. But a lot of bees expire during that period. So if she's laying 1,500 eggs a day, as long as she's laying more eggs than are dying in collecting the nectar or getting to their old age, then the population will go up. So yeah, 30,000 I'd say at the moment.
Wow.
But anywhere between 20 and 60,000.
Lots of guesses for 16 days. We've got a 40 days, 14.
40 day would be in trouble, because in 40 days the hive would definitely well and truly have a lot of expired bees.
We did have a guess for 6 years.
6, yeah. That was my clue. Sweet 16, you get it? So it's 16 days. You're right. So 16 days from the egg to an emerging queen. The cool thing about that, you'll notice that when we had it on camera, it sticks out a long way. It's kind of like a peanut. Is that it's definitely obvious, and they've got a couple of cups next to each other there, which means that they've got a few backups. So I'm confident that they'll replace the queen, and the queen will emerge, and that looks to be, maybe it's definitely a larvae, so it's older than 3 days. So in the next 2 weeks, it'll pop out, maybe during the holidays. But the issue, I fully expect them to be able to raise that queen. What I'm worried about though is that when she goes for her mating flight, are there going to be enough drones flying around in our environment for her to successfully mate and to be a productive queen back in the hive? So again, we'll check it again in a couple of weeks, see if the queen's emerged, and then again in a couple of weeks, because it takes a week or so for them to reach an age where they can go and do those mating flights, and then maybe even another 7 days afterwards until she's ready to lay. So hopefully they're a little bit more happy with the queen that supersedes them, because the one that was in there looked amazing, but
No, she looked really healthy last week.
she looked really healthy and really long and really the signs of a good queen are at least from a human perspective, what we look for is the physical appearance. So she was really long and she looked really really healthy, but obviously not much chop. They've replaced her straight away. So look, our honey is
quite a bit of honey now.
Slowly coming out. You can see the cells here are just very slowly trickling out. What's always interesting is when you do two at the same time, watching which one drains fastest, and that's again to do with where they collected the nectar from. It will get there. We'll put a timer on it, but I'm looking at that. It's going to take most of the day to get out. And I might actually, while I've got my bee suit on, I might prop it up just a little bit at the front.
Caleb would like to know how often we will get honey from the hives.
Yeah, it's a good question. So it all depends on what's going on with the weather. So if there's more floral blooms, if there's more trees in flower, if the weather is kinder to our plants, then the produce that they can collect is a lot more. So in the last year, we've collected quite a fair bit of honey if you look back, but it's really slowed down since that drought period we had. So right before we broke up for the summer holidays, both of these hives were full, and we tapped quite a lot of that honey. And this is the very next time. So how many months is that? That's 4 months it's taken for them to get to this point where they've got excess honey. And really, they were quite light on honey up until the last few weeks. So and that would have been a couple of weeks after the rain just started again. So trees and plants won't offer a lot of nectar unless they're doing really well themselves, and that's a lot to do with the weather. So when there's lots of moisture and humidity around, plants do better, and when plants do better, the bees do better. And as beekeepers, that's, you just got to go with the flow. So when it's there and there's lots of it, we feel like we can take it. When there's not, like you saw with that pollen patty, it's our duty to make sure that they've got the right stuff to keep going. So I'm just going to put some stuff underneath the front of this hive so that it has a steeper angle. Might be a bit too steep now. Any other questions?
Asani would like to know, what else do bees eat?
Oh, Jesus, it's heavy. So it's a mixture of that pollen and nectar. So they'll eat pollen, but they don't eat it straight. They don't eat it dry. They mix it with nectar, and they turn it into what's called bee bread. I mean, we call it that because that's what we can relate to. But the bees wouldn't call it that. So they mix it with the nectar and they mix it with the pollen. And they eat it at different times. They feed the bee bread to the brood, but they don't feed the same stuff to queen. So that queen that's going to be raised is on a very special diet. She's not going to be eating bee bread. She will be eating royal jelly. But I said the nurse bees are the ones that feed it. They're the only ones in the hive that can actually make it, and it's more like a liquid diet than it is a bread diet, for lack of a better word.
Kobe would like to know, what is the life expectancy of a drone bee?
Yeah, okay. I think we had this one last week. It can vary again depending on how what's going on in the environment. And if you remember last week, I think we had a bit of a joke about it. If the drone bee does its job and is able to find a queen and pass on their genetics, they die. So if a drone bee is a healthy bee and does what it's meant to do, their life can be cut dramatically short. From anywhere, after a couple of weeks, they can start those drone flights. But they can, they'll live up to 40, 50 days, similar to like a worker bee. But again, all dependent. Like I said, the worrying thing for me at the moment is I know that these have got drones in them, but they're starting to wind down their drone production. So when this queen's going for a mating flight, and the drones that they're picking up aren't from our hives, they're from all of the hives around the environment, I'm hoping there's still enough drones for her to successfully mate.
Is that a seasonal thing with the drones?
Yeah, so as you get closer to winter, typically speaking, they'll kick the drones out. So they'll stop feeding them and they'll get rid of them out of the hive because there's less hives that are making queens, so there's less chance of them passing on the genetics. Yeah, so during winter, you'll typically do a bee inspection. There'll be no drones, and what's happened is the hive's decided that they're a resource-intense, person to have in the hive, or bee to have in the hive, and they've kicked them out by then. And come around spring, they start making them all up again because, each hive that's doing well wants to pass on its genetics for the next generation. So that's kind of their safety bet, that if something happens to this hive, at least they've passed on their genetics. Any other questions?
Masani would like to know, do all bees have a job to do?
They do. Look, they're not like humans and they don't have titles, and they change jobs quite quickly depending on where the need is. And in that hive that we looked in where the queen was being raised, a lot of those bees that would have been doing other jobs, perhaps they were foragers, or perhaps they were guard bees, can be redeployed into different roles. So we said that nurse bees are the only ones that can produce the royal jelly. So if there wasn't enough nurse bees in there, some of those bees will be given that job of being a nurse bee and making the royal jelly. You've got other jobs like, and we give them human names, architect bees, which are in charge of creating the honeycomb. Guard bees, which are in charge of manning the front. There'll be guard bees out along the front there now, making sure that the bees that are arriving aren't there to steal their honey, then that the hive is safe. There'll be bees that are undertaker bees who are in charge of making sure all of the bees that have expired or passed away or dead are taken away and dropped off at a distance. There'll be bees in charge of cleaning cells. There's a lot of different jobs. So queen attendants, their job is just to follow the queen and to make sure that she has everything that she desires. She doesn't need to go look for food. She doesn't need to go look for pollen or any of that stuff. It's all hands on deck. And when you find a queen, which is a shame that I couldn't do that today, we did it last week, those queen attendants form a ring around her wherever she goes, like a posse. They just follow with them.
What a life.
We've got time for one or two more questions.
There's no more questions at the moment.
That's good. All right. Then that might be a good sign. anything from you guys before we part ways? This honey that is very slowly coming out, but will now pick up. I might do the last part. Yeah, it will be available today, but it will last forever. Literally, it's the only food source that's non-perishable, so there's no rush in us getting it into your homes. It'll stay safe in our school office, and when things return to normal, hopefully sooner than later, it'll be available in our school office.
Vinny has asked, why do bees like honey so much?
That's a good question. Oh, I mean, who doesn't like honey? No, I'm just joking. Look,
Honey on crumpets.
yeah, honey on
Amazing.
crumpets is good. Bees like honey because it's the food source that they make, I guess. They don't have a lot of choices being a bee. It's not like they can go and eat a capsicum or eat an apple. It's just their food. So, you know, they like honey because, I guess, for a number of reasons, it's got a lot of energy for them. It stores well. It will be something that if we were to get a cold snap and heaven forbid it started to snow out here, we've had everything else this year from bushfires to coronavirus, you might end up with a snowstorm. It's the type of thing that'll stay in the hive, and you can eat it. You know, it won't go use by date, or there's no expiration on it. So when they've got it to the point where they have in this hive and it's capped, you know, a year, 2 years, 3 years, 10 years down the track, it's still food that's good to eat for the bees.
So I can see ants starting to come around now where you're tapping the honey.
Yep.
So they can't get into the hive because they seal it off, is that right? Or otherwise they'd just be ants in the
Yeah,
hive
so
all the
look,
time?
the ants tend to be something that coexists with the beehive, but not because they're getting honey, but because it's a really warm spot. It's not ever a nuisance because the bees won't allow them in the hive, but in a traditional beehive they don't have these windows, so there's not a crevice for them to kind of exist. If we were to drip a drop of honey, then they'd love it too. They'd get they'd be taking that back to their thing, but or their nest. But yeah, it's certainly not involved in our honey, so it's not a problem for us. And when we seal it all back up, the bees will do their thing and shoo them on their merry way. Okay.
Beautiful.
All right, no worries, guys. We won't see you again. We won't be able to do another live stream for a little while, and like I said before, hopefully we're back to normality sooner rather than later. But if we're not, there's every chance that we can do another one, and we might even be able to check up on that queen and whether or not she's emerged. So in the interim, have a happy and safe holiday break. I know that holiday is a bit of a loose term, but try and make the most of it at home, and we'll see you on the other side. Bye.
Bye, guys.